to start up businesses and new ideas in Africa, not just at small scale but also large scale. And so I think there are ways to manage the obvious conflict between China and the U.S. that could be quite beneficial, because the U.S. is not just the government entity, which is mainly true in China, but also private sector that's looking for really interesting alternatives.
So you touch on a very important thing. For growth, you need finance.
Absolutely.
Clearly, institutions like African Export-Import Bank are playing a stellar role in financing the development of Africa under the exemplary, outstanding leadership of President Dr. Orama, who's sitting there. Let's give him a big hand, please. And there are other institutions as well playing a major role. And global Africans, the 2 billion people, I think will increasingly fund that growth. But the question for you is, US is still the mecca of capital. If I remember a McKinsey study at some point of time, it said that it's $87 trillion of global investable capital, of which 73 trillion, the numbers may have changed, are in the United States of America. What can African financial sector leaders, African political leaders do to change the perception of risk of investing in Africa? Because still a lot of capital doesn't go into Africa because of perception of risk, which probably outweighs the reality.
Well, one, the perception of risk does outweigh the reality. So what does that mean? First, actively educating private sector players in the U.S. that are big pools of capital about what the opportunities are in Africa is very important. So I don't know how many of you have gone to talk to, let's say, Larry Fink, who runs, one of our largest pools of capital in the U.S., BlackRock, or any of the others. So that's the first thing, right? The second is to also understand, how to turn the African story, continent-wide, country by country, into something that people really understand, which is this is diversification. When I talk to people about why invest in emerging markets, as they're called, the diversification story is a really important one, not to be ignored, as is the question of the future. So the demographic dividend that's possible is very important. Third thing, talk about the great strengths that Africa has. So think about the jump to the iPhone, or since I'm on the board of Alphabet, I should say the Pixel phone. Here we have a group that's already ready to be completely digital. So that's the second or third. The fourth, though, is to also recognize what are the weaknesses that actually are legitimate to worry about. And the biggest one, in terms of risk, is one that is visible to all of you and visible to all of us, which is the currency risk. Right? So U.S. investors, European investors are obviously looking for return in dollar terms. And how one thinks about the ups and downs, some pretty dramatic, in the value of local currencies is going to be critically important. And so let's be honest about what the challenges are. Let's think through those solutions. And some of those solutions may well be creating new capital markets capabilities that don't currently exist. So it is very difficult, I know from personal experience, to hedge local currency exposure in almost any African nation or other nations outside of the U.S. Why is that the case? We'll have to think it through. So, count me very optimistic in this world of reglobalization. Another shot for the various African nations represented here in the Caribbean nations to play a very, really important role, in part because the strengths that African nations and Caribbean nations have are now, I think, more relevant than others. But it's got to be particularly well managed when it comes to using capital, dealing with the demographic dividend. What's the role that these nations can play as China resorts itself and the U.S. resorts its relationship with China? And how do you think about being on the winning end of some of these major challenges that we've talked about, climate change, education, et cetera? Those are some of the things I'd be thinking about if I were a policymaker or a business leader represented in this room.
We have covered a lot of topics. And it's been a very rich conversation. So one last thing. Where do you see the Fed rate December 2024?
So look, I've been in the camp that says the possibility of a rate cut 50-50. I do not think there's going to be, there was a point when the U.S. markets were expecting 6, then 5, then 4 cuts. Now, this morning there was pretty good inflation news, so the markets are expecting somewhere between 1 and 2 cuts. I think maybe 1 towards the end of the year. And so the big theme is I wouldn't look to the Fed to bail out anybody by getting interest rates very low anytime soon.
So, but okay, let me follow that up with an easy question.
Okay.
Outcome of the U.S. presidential election.
Closer than one would like to think, given that we've got a perfectly sensible senior statesman running against a person who's now, who's got quite a history. We'll put it that way. But to be very serious, the reason this is close, and this is really important, is because it may be true in some of your countries as well. We have had a long, long period of some of the challenges I've talked about: income and wealth inequality, health inequality, et cetera. And the reason we have populism now in the U.S., as represented by Donald Trump, is not that he created this, but that he became the voice of it. And so, one can have whatever view you have of the man, the character, et cetera, but you must respect and understand that he is the embodiment of very legitimate concerns by a large number of Americans. Fine, you can dispute me, but I'd like to tell the truth. And we have a large number of people in the United States who are feeling very disaffected. We have a large number of people who feel that they have no future. You heard me talk about some of the issues that the Edelman folks have found. And so, I am not in any sense an apologist for Donald Trump. I am not at all. But I'm also, as a policymaker, and I would encourage all of you as business leaders and policymakers to recognize the underlying dissatisfaction that's leading to some of these challenges.
Terrific. So they used to say it's the economy stupid. I think increasingly we need to say it's the politics stupid.
Or maybe it's stupid politics.
Our stupid politics. Okay. Thank you so much for this excellent insights and views, Roger. Brilliant. I think Alan Greenspan said it right, and I'm just quoting him, when he said that Dr. Roger Ferguson is one of the most effective vice chairs in the history of the Federal Reserve. I think. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Institutions like African Export.
Now, every year, Afreximbank produces its flagship Africa Trade Report. It's a vital piece of work that helps navigate through this fast-changing world. This year, we're proud to launch the report and the 2024 Africa Trade and Economic Outlook Report right here, right now, with you. So, to lead the proceedings, I invite to the stage Dr. Yemi Kale. Dr. Yemi is Afreximbank's Group Chief Economist and Managing Director of Research and International Cooperation. Please welcome him.
Your Excellencies, distinguished ladies and gentlemen, I am delighted to present brief highlights of the two major reports that we're officially launching today. The flagship Africa Trade Report for 2024, which has been themed Climate Implications of the AfCFTA Implementation, and the maiden 2024 Africa Trade and Economic Outlook Report, which has the theme, A Resilient Africa, Delivering Growth in a Turbulent World. Both reports will be made available via codes that will be on the links that will be on the screen following the launch. Undoubtedly, one of the most engaging debates and conversations over the last decade has been the global climate system. It is also well understood that, and widely accepted that while Africa bears the brunt of climate change events, the continent's carbon emissions are the lowest in the world, estimated at just about 3% of global carbon emissions. At the same time, the urgent need to fulfill its development aspirations and economic transformation, which partly led to the development of the Africa Continental Free Trade Agreement, has created debate about the potential impact of the AfCFTA on carbon emissions and the need to strike a balance between its development and economic transformation goals and climate considerations. Now, from this conversation, two schools of thought have emerged. While both groups acknowledge the fact that the AfCFTA has significant development benefits to Africa, and its successful implementation will trigger accelerated development and economic transformation in the continent, one group also believes that the drive for industrialization and the associated increase in urbanization would worsen carbon emissions. On the other hand, the second group maintains that by emphasizing intra-African trade and reducing extra-African trade, carbon emissions generated will be lowered through shorter shipping distances. It is against this backdrop that this study was conducted in the 2024 Africa Trade Report with the objective of assessing empirically the relative impact of the AfCFTA implementation on carbon emissions in Africa. Using data from Global Trade Analysis Project e-Power model and the computable general equilibrium model as the analytical framework, the report concludes that the AfCFTA provides a route towards meeting the developmental aspirations of African countries while at the same time addressing climate change concerns. In other words, the implementation of the AfCFTA also serves as a strategy towards reducing carbon emissions in the continent. Your Excellencies, distinguished ladies and gentlemen, 2023 African trade improved, reflecting the resilience of the African economy on the one hand, and on the other hand, the potential of the AfCFTA by boosting intra-African trade as a tool to hedge against global shocks. Our analysis in the report also revealed large untapped potential in intra-African trade, especially with respect to machinery, electricity, motor vehicles, and food products. Our outlook for 2024 and 2025, however, despite the very challenging economic environment in 2023, remains positive, and we expect most macroeconomic indicators to improve in 2024 and 2025. Growth is expected to be stronger in 2024 than it was in 2023, and also be higher than the global average. Inflation, though still currently high, is expected to reduce, and we expect that trend to continue downwards for the rest of the year into 2025. Debt pressure is easing. Debt indicators are generally expected to improve. Intra-African trade, we expect, is going to continue improving. And we also expect to anticipate a more stable exchange rate environment. And this expectation is backed by the improving economic environment, generally as a result of improving economic activity across the continent and in key African markets globally. Also, as the growth-limiting effects of weather shocks subside as supply bottlenecks gradually improve and energy reliability for manufacturing output improves, including a rebound in infrastructure investment spending, a recovery in tourism arrivals following the COVID-19 pandemic, and the benefits of economic diversification, stronger commodity prices, various fiscal monetary policies being introduced by various countries, and also the various financial support and initiatives by multilateral development financial institutions like the African Export-Import Bank. We believe that all of these factors will lead to a better 2024 than 2023. I will end this brief overview by saying that the AfCFTA, as illustrated by the findings in this report, is a key intervention with capacity to drive global Africa's development and structural transformation with little impact on carbon emissions, especially if the focus is to promote trade among global Africans. Your Excellencies, distinguished ladies and gentlemen, against this backdrop, I'm pleased to invite the President and Chairman of the Board of the African Export-Import Bank, Professor Benedict Orama, together with the Deputy Chairperson of the African Union, as well as the Executive Director, International Trade Center, to come and launch both reports. Thank you.
Africa navigate economic transformation in this so-called poly-crisis world? The next plenary will tackle just that question, and for this we have a great moderator who is a familiar face to anyone who watches CNN. Please welcome news anchor and correspondent Eleni Giorkas.
Gentlemen, lovely to be with you today. Incredible to join you for this wonderful event. Our topic today is navigating economic growth and prosperity in a poly-crisis world. I'd like to welcome our distinguished guests, our host, Mr. John A. Roll, Governor of the Central Bank of Bahamas. Please come through. Welcome, sir. May I say I'm having the best time in the Bahamas. I think everyone else is too. Thank you so much. Professor Yemi Osinbajo, former Vice President of Nigeria. Please take a seat. I'll join you. There we go. I asked the question to the professor, is he an academic turned politician or a politician turned academic? Welcome, sir. Welcome, sir. Please take a seat. Dr. Donald Kaberuka, former Minister of Finance, Rwanda, and the former President of the African Development Bank. Welcome, sir. I couldn't count on my hands how many times I've interviewed Dr. Kaberuka. One of the incredible minds. How many times? 5 at least. Kevin Greenridge, the Governor of Barbados. I think we need to fill the spaces and the gaps with clapping, guys. This is like this walk. Thank you very much. Dennis Denya, Senior Executive Vice President, Afreximbank, our hosts. The company, the bank that has made all of this happen. Welcome, sir. Dr. Howard Nicholas, former Associate Professor in Economics at the International Institute of Social Studies of the Erasmus University of Rotterdam. Welcome. Thank you. You might also know him. He has a video that went viral about why Africa remains underdeveloped and why the world wants Africa to remain underdeveloped. So welcome. Great to have you. Fantastic. Welcome. To hear from Professor Jeffrey Sachs. He's a professor of economics at Columbia University. We're waiting for a Zoom to get up and running, so we will stop our conversation to listen to that as well. Just to repeat, our topic today is how we plan to navigate economic transformation in a poly-crisis world. I think we all know what these crises are, whether it's geopolitics, whether it's climate change, whether it's the impact of inflation. I mean, frankly, there's a plethora of issues. One thing we have come to realize is the African continent is used to dealing with many crises, whether they're exogenous, whether they're issues we deal with locally. But one thing that always happens is the resilience and the grit and the endurance to be able to navigate our way through it. It comes at a time rising across the board. On that note, we're going to start our conversation. All right, I want to start off with our host. I think it is important to speak to Governor of the Central Bank of Bahamas first. Governor Roll, great to see you. Welcome. You know, we were looking at the AfriCaribbean links, and there's not only a cultural link, there's a historical link, there's a potential economic link. And I want to get a sense from you, with all these crises that are playing out, how much more difficult does it make policy for you when you see things falling apart at a global level, and then that impacts you in some way? There's a domino effect on inflation or the inability to trade, because we're starting to look a lot more inwards. And when you've got the two big players looking inwards, that impacts everyone.
Well, there's quite a lot, and thank you for inviting me to the panel. There's a lot that can be said. When you look at the Caribbean countries, we are on the receiving end, so we fit very neatly the definition of small countries, and so you're not in a position to influence the shocks that are coming at you. So in the case of the inflation shocks, we felt the experience in terms of increased demands on drawdown in our foreign exchange. We feel the impact of the interest rate run-up on the cost of public debt, servicing public debt. So again, we're on the receiving end, and even to the extent that we have to synchronize our domestic interest rates with the international counterparts, it is really to manage not necessarily inflation that's domestically originating in the case of the Caribbean economies, but really just to maintain the balance insofar as you might have capital flows and other pressures. And finally, and there are many other points, but this other point that I would stress is that we're tourism exporting countries for the most part, and so all of the geopolitical tensions, whether it's the fuel costs and the impact on the cost of travel or the supply chain or other uncertainties, those are impacting the disposable income and the spending capacity of tourists. So we feel the impact, and when we translate that into the discussion in terms of resilience and the very excellent presentation that we've had earlier, I know in the case of the Bahamas, we tend to reduce it to having a more diversified economic base. And again, looking at what's happening relative to global Africa, diversification in many respects does not necessarily mean new industries and sectors, but making the industries which exist draw on market opportunities in areas such as Africa. So I think we understand, how to deal with the quote-unquote poly-crisis and the potential that Africa represents, particularly since trade now is much more than trade in goods. The potential to trade in services and to leverage professional and other expertise also opens up great opportunities for knowledge sharing with Africa.
Fantastic. Mr. Vice President, great to have you with us. You've been out of politics for a while.
Right.
Yes. But I'm sure you're watching on, and with a totally different perspective of how to deal with things. I want to talk about Nigeria for a bit. I was there recently. I went to Aliko Dangote's oil refinery. It is incredible to see what can be done when you've got investment and you can build a refinery of that size. It speaks to keeping raw materials on the continent and in Nigeria as well. How are you characterizing what you're seeing at a global level and how that is impacting, for example, Nigeria's ability to not only maintain its economic power on the continent, but transcend it with all the challenges that it faces?
Okay, thank you. I think first, the problem always with situations where you have multiple sorts of challenges is in being able to characterize the challenges properly so that the solutions that you suggest are then appropriate. I think that for us in Nigeria, the question really has always been one of ensuring that we're able to encouraging the private sector to invest, creating an environment for the private sector to invest. So really, when you look at the global challenges on the one hand, and you look at our challenges, the question really is not for us, not so much the global headwinds, it is more getting stuff done and fully implemented, speaks to not just, the fact that the private sector is mature and is able to do big things, but also that the private sector is able to attract, cheaper capital, even sometimes, than the government. So I think it's altogether positive if you look at how the environment speaks. But really, the challenges are not necessarily the huge global headwinds. For us,
we've got to focus on our own challenges.
We have to deal with the local issues and local challenges. Yeah. And I think that has been done quite creditably when you look at what the private sector is doing. I mean, BOA, another very big organization, is also about to commission a refinery. I mean, they've also built a very massive refinery. I think that's almost in the order of about 250 or so thousand barrels a day, and that's also private. So I think there is, a fair amount of progress in terms of, how the private sector is working.
Fantastic, and really important points, and I want to pick up with that with Dr. Kaberuka. You mentioned, access to financing and what that will ultimately mean in this poly-crisis world. And something that you and I have discussed a lot through the years is the unwarranted risk premium that the private sector on the continent consistently pays. And importantly, when you see global crises, this does tend to mean that people become a lot more risk averse. You've got interest rates that are rising dramatically. Is that still the case at this point in time? And how do we navigate this reality where we can say, hang on, you're mispricing us. It's not as risky as you think. Why are you coming to Africa and wanting high double-digit returns, which puts enormous pressure not only on the companies that want to do business, but also on economies and average people?
Right. Thank you very much, Ellen. Good to see you again, and all my friends here. I have just 3 points I want to make, and I'll make them very briefly. When I spoke to this same conference in Accra last year, I said, we have to get used to managing crisis. We have to get used to managing crisis. I did mention that the first crisis, at least in my lifetime, which shook up the global economy, was in 72 and 73. In 72, with the end of the fixed exchange rate regime and the devaluation of the dollar, all right, which President Nixon did at the time. And then immediately followed by the first oil shock, which increased the oil 6 times in the first place, and then 17 times in a few years, right? And then you had the Asian financial crisis, you have the global financial crisis, you have COVID, you have geopolitical. So I think the secret in how we respond to this poly-crisis is to begin by accepting the fact that there will always be crisis, and we prepare for that. We cannot treat them as if there's something unique. The difference is they come at the same time, they are deep, and are multifaceted. But we have to prepare in our countries to manage this crisis. How do we do it? 3 things. I said, be quite quick. Number 1, we can no longer fully rely on the international financial system architecture we have relied upon for a long time when you have got shocks. There is still some assistance from the international financial system, but as you saw during COVID, it didn't work very well for us. So what is the response? And it's important I say it here. Response number 1 is build Africa's own institutions. Make them stronger. The African Union, the African Import-Export Bank, the African Development Bank, many other organizations. Because if you don't do that, and continue simply to count on the international financial architecture, we have seen how badly it can get.
Can I ask you I'm sorry to interject, and this is important, you mentioned the African Union. What kind of governance model, the AU?
No, that's a different question. You see, we can't begin by saying that because our African institutions have some structural deficiencies,
Yeah.
all right, we should therefore leave them behind and work with global institutions. Because the global institutions have their own agendas. So I think we have a responsibility to build our institutions, recognizing they have some structural deficiencies, but work on them to make sure they're fit for purpose. Now, the third thing we have to do, again, I'm happy to say it here, in the Caribbean, it's very good that in the global south, we begin to build those links, like we are doing now with the Caribbean, with the ASEAN region, which will reinforce what we are doing. So it will be a kind of globalization which is regionalized. Someone had called it a poly-globalization, because the globalization we've been used to is not working for us. And finally, to answer your question, is Africa risky to the extent which you say? You know, during the global financial crisis, I was still president of the ADB, and literally I got calls from all these big international media. They had reached one conclusion, that Africa will be the continent most to suffer.
And it wasn't.
I had no evidence for that. I could not see objectively what was it, but they had reached the conclusion. So what I did with my colleague Ping, who was head of the AU, and my colleague from ECA, we called all the finance ministers and governors of the central bank to Tunis. This is what the world is saying. So let's check. Truth is, we suffered because of the decline in global demand, but our financial system survived very robustly, better than Greece, better than Cyprus.
Thanks for reminding me. On Greece. Listen, but it was also hot money. It was hot money that came in.
So what I'm saying to Ellen is that there are some real risks, market risks, currency risks, political risks in Africa like somewhere else. We know how to manage those. But when it comes to perceived risk, what some people in this place call the zip code problem. The zip code. Because we are on a zip code Africa, we pay a premium for this perceived risk. That's what it is. That said, we have a few things in some of our countries that are fixed, in terms of debt management, in terms of fiscal discipline, in terms of allowing markets to adjust. But that is a technocratic issue. The political issue is strengthen Africa's own institutions, increase cooperation in the global south, as we're doing now, and make sure that we build the buffers needed, because there will always be crises. That's a long answer to a short question.
No, it's brilliant. Thank you so much. Deserves a round of applause. I mean, can I just say this? The perceived risk and the zip code. And I will never forget during the pandemic, where everyone was like, let's watch the African continent, things are really going to go bad. It only went really bad when South Africa had strong enough genomic testing to figure out that Omicron existed, and then we were slapped with flight bans across the continent because of the perceived risk, not because of fact that Omicron was all over the continent. And, we were vulnerable because these bad decisions were constantly made because we can't let Africans travel because, we don't know what that means. And it's really infuriating to see it in hindsight because it's a constant fight. And it's like, how do we amplify our voices to stop these bad decisions being made against the African continent? And Dr. Nicholas, I want to bring you in here because you have been very vocal on why the world wants Africa to stay where it is, continue the status quo of exporting its raw materials, the zip code problem, the risk premium. Could you give me a sense of where you think we are today? Because you've been talking about this for many years. Do you feel there's a change on the continent, the global Africa, efforts that we're seeing versus how the world perceives us right now?
Thank you, Lena. Thank you, African Export-Import Bank, for inviting to this August panel. Wonderful to be here. I would like to begin with a bit of history in answer to this, and that is when Britain was a colonizer, it actually banned manufacturing production in all its colonies, including the United States. It banned it. Why? Because it knew that once a country started export-oriented manufacturing, it's the beginning of the end. That's why it banned it. And what is very important is the academics and policymakers of the advanced countries, the British, Adam Smith, justified the ban. Adam Smith said to the United States, you should be an agricultural producer. Some of us wish the US went down that road, but no, the US went down export-oriented manufacturing. Today, so this comes in answer to your question, the advanced countries, having belittled export-oriented manufacturing, are now doing that. There is a massive drive to industrialization in the advanced countries. Let me give you an example. In the last 5 years, there is a 1,000% increase in industrial policies, a 1,000% increase. Yet we were all told, this is bad, don't do this. Now the advanced countries are doing it. The kicker now comes in. I'm waiting. Are they going to support Africa to industrialize? Forget it. In the last couple of years, academic papers and policymakers have started saying, Africa shouldn't do this because of climate change.
So the hypocrisy and the contradiction.
Okay, so in other words, climate change is your responsibility to deal with, not the fact that these countries are the ones responsible for the climate change damage in the first place. But now you have to pay the price. You have to pay the price by not industrializing. Sorry, the second thing that they say is AI and robotics. You can't deal with AI and robotics. That is only for advanced countries. This is all nonsense. We know it's nonsense.
Okay,
I leave it at that.
I have to, Dennis, we still need to hear from you, and Governor, we also need to hear from you, but I've just heard word that Professor Jeffrey Sachs is now ready to joining us via Zoom in New York. He's one of the most renowned economists globally. I mean, it's always incredible to hear some of his thoughts, and I'm sure he's been listening in on this as well. He's a best-selling author, a global leader in sustainable development. So, Professor Sachs, are you there?
I am here. Can
Fantastic.
you hear me?
Great to have you with us. I wish you were joining us in this most beautiful place.
Oh, I couldn't agree more with you.
Were you hearing some of that conversation?
Absolutely.
All right.
Yes, hearing, nodding in great approval, and wanting to add a few quick points. Africa's most important challenge is unity. We're living in a world of big players, China, India, the United States, Europe. Africa needs to be a big player. It's 1.4 billion people, on the same scale as India and China. It will be perhaps 2.5 billion people by mid-century, larger than China and India. But of course, the Congress of Berlin left it as 54 separate countries. And that is deleterious for geopolitics. It is deleterious for risk premia. It is deleterious for scale of investment and industry. And it is definitely deleterious for geopolitics. You cannot operate in this world as a small country. Even the small countries that are successful are part of somebody's world. And Africa is too big to be part of somebody's world. It's got to be Africa as a fundamental pillar of the world scene. And now the African Union is the 21st member of the G21. This is very important, but it's not yet been used effectively. Africa has a seat at the front table and it needs to assert its seat. The global financial architecture needs fundamental change. Incidentally, in the mechanical formulas used by Moody's, Fitch, and S&P Global, and I mean the mechanical ways that these credit ratings are rated, small and poor countries are rated lower, not whether they have worse growth prospects. Africa has brighter growth prospects, but they are mechanically downgraded because of size and scale and, frankly, a very analytically inappropriate set of standards. At a basic level, at an economic fundamental level, Africa has the capacity to achieve sustained growth over the next 40 years to 2063 of 7% per annum compounded. That would make Africa, of course, a high-income region of the world. It would make Africa an enormous part of the world economy, and this is absolutely feasible. The core of success is sustained high levels of investment, starting, by the way, with education as the most fundamental of all investments, not because it's nice and good and humane and moral, it is, but because it's got the highest return economically of anything that any country can do, is investing in the skills of its young people. And then the physical infrastructure and all of the business development that will come. Africa lags badly in education right now. It's not even on the charts because it's not even part of the international comparison of the OECD program, the PISA program. It needs to get on the charts and it needs to climb the scale. And it's perfectly possible, but it requires a lot more resources. That means a lot more financing. That means a lot more long-term borrowing, by the way, which is just fine if it's long-term because the rates of growth that will come from that are extremely high. But my main point is this cannot happen one country at a time. A very strong African Union, as Donald was saying just a moment ago, African institutions like the African Export-Import Bank playing a scaled role for the continent, like the African Development Bank, I would say at least 10 times the scale that it is right now. I really mean it. I'm not being hyperbolic. The African Development Bank should be lending $50 to $100 billion a year. And there's no reason why it can't. Get the foreigners off the board of the bank. If they're saying, no, you can't do this, get them off the bank. You don't need them. You need partners that will scale up these institutions. Get the African voice from the African Union into the G21 deliberations. And of course, next year's G21 will be in South Africa, which is great. Tremendous opportunity. So make a very strong union institutionally, the quality of the commission, the quality of the leadership, the boldness of the vision, a 40-year high growth, high investment scenario, a trajectory, renegotiate how debt is evaluated because it's all wrong analytically. The IMF and the World Bank need big fixing, and it's possible with a strong voice and a strong analytical approach. But the basic outlook that I would say is China grew more than 7% per year between 1980 and 2020. India, 20 years later, is now top of the pack. It's Africa's turn. It's Africa's time. I shouldn't say turn because the turn was a long time ago, but it's Africa's time for a high growth, high investment, high finance trajectory. And this is what needs to be agreed across the continent, and the leaders of the institutions and the political leaders in Africa really need to see that a strong union in a world of big players and big sharks, by the way, but big players is what is the key for making these breakthroughs. So those are the main points that I wanted to share.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Professor Sachs. It was such an honor to have you join us today, and fascinating to hear your thoughts. I think the audience really enjoyed a lot of what you've said, and importantly, because I think you're really trying to tell us to amplify the African voice, and I think
Absolutely.
we're seeing it happening. And the point is getting Africa at the negotiating table in those big institutions are going to be part of this story. So thank you so much, sir.
Wonderful. It's an honor and pleasure to join. I just wish I could be there in person.
Yeah,
enjoy the beauty.
We've had a great turnout, not only because we wanted to have these important discussions, but also we're in a great place. Lovely
Take
to
care,
see you.
everybody.
Thank you, sir.
Bye-bye.
Dennis, I want to come to you. I mean, you heard Professor Sachs there saying we need to scale AFDB and Afreximbank tenfold. Can you guys do that? What do you need? We need money. We need funding.
Absolutely. To turn the potential into reality, you need strong institutions. The African Export-Import Bank has done a lot in terms of tackling the issues that affect the continent. Our ability to support companies like Dangote depends on the capital that our shareholders give us. If you recall, during the COVID-19 pandemic, the African Union said, go and raise new equity so you can help us deal with this pandemic. And we did. We provided a guarantee of $2 billion to enable vaccines to come to the continent. And in return, African governments actually helped us raise $2.6 billion in new equity. That is making the institution stronger, and it can now intervene more on the continent. We need African solutions to Africa's problem. We raise funding from the continent in the form of deposit from central banks, and then leverage those to gain more funding to assist the continent deal with its economic challenges. So yes, we need stronger institutions to deal with the challenges that the continent has, either in terms of capital or in terms of funding.
How do we get more capital and funding?
In terms of funding, in 2014, Afreximbank launched the Central Bank Deposit Program. In that year, we raised only $75 million. But since then, cumulatively, we have raised $38 billion. So central bank deposits now constitute about 30% of our funding base. So it's money from the continent. And why is that important? It enables us to provide central banks with a better return than they can currently get. But it also enables us to reduce our cost of funding, meaning that we can now lend to African entrepreneurs at a lower cost than we could. So it's a win-win situation.
Thank you. Okay. I'm going to ask the organizers to expand our time. I'm not happy with 13 minutes left. Governor Greenidge, great to have you with us. I mean, you're listening intently on everything we've discussed. And I wanted to actually ask you to the point of what Dr. Nicholas was referring to on whether the world wants Africa to industrialize, but I think the global south, I think emerging markets. And then the climate issue has come up time and time again. You know, not using our fossil fuels because we have to do it better and cleaner. And I think everyone is on the same page of that. But for you as Barbados and frankly small island developing states, and even the Bahamas, you're at the coalface of climate. You're dealing with it in many aspects. Could you give me a sense of how you guys are thinking about and dealing with this crisis at a time where I think the emerging market world is also very cognizant of the fact that it needs to grow and it should have the right to grow?
Thank you very much, and thank you for having me here. You're correct. We in the Caribbean, and by the way, I see the Caribbean, CARICOM, as you said, global Africa, we are the 55th state. So,
round of applause, yes.
And I must say that as the 55th state and being separated by a huge distance, Afreximbank has come to fill that role and help with the connection back to the climate, the continent, providing quite a significant role there. So again, thanks to Afreximbank. Yeah, we in the Caribbean are living the global the climate crisis every day. And how we have sought to deal with that is simply to continue to build our resilience to the climate crisis, mitigation, adaptation, moving off, and I mean, Barbados, for example, is not a fossil fuel producer, but moving towards renewable energy, green technology, and building resilience within our economic space, diversifying our economic base through innovation and technology. What we have sought to do and what we've been calling for and what our constraints are particularly is adequate financing. Financing that, as you know, for a problem that is immediate upon us but have a long return in terms of building climate change, we're calling for financing that is cheaper and longer term as opposed to short term, which really impacts on the inadequate measures of debt sustainability, etc. So, for example, in Barbados, we have, led by Barbados, we have called for the Bridgetown Initiative. The Bridgetown Initiative recently launched, again, the website and Bridgetown Initiative 3.0, where small developing countries, etc., is calling for increased concessional financing to developing countries to help with the financing. Call for things like SDRs, AMF currency.
Sorry, you're calling for all of this, but are you seeing it actually happening?
Well, that's why we keep calling, because there's...
Well, that's my issue, right? Because we're calling for better financing, we're calling for a consent, and this is the thing, it's like the money's not actually materializing. Is it materializing? This
is what Jeffrey, I think, is calling for. So if for example, we all gather together in support behind Bridgetown Initiative, which will benefit everyone, each of our countries, and getting financing to us, if we all gather, then we cannot be ignored. Yeah. If we all get together with one voice and support things like the Bridgetown Initiative and what we are doing, calling for it, because it doesn't matter how grand the plans are, there's still limits to what Afreximbank can do on its own. There's limits to what individually we can do, but if collectively we can get a rechannel of those funds, so it's been promised, then, but one voice.
Exactly.
Africa, Global Africa voice. I believe we can make a difference. They have already started. This is the first time I came from IMF in terms of working there. This is perhaps one of the first time in our history where the world and the global financial architecture and the architects of it is starting to listen. The IMF, the World Bank, and those supporting starting to listen and say, maybe, we need to start looking at things a little differently. There's a lot of money pledged, 650 billion SDRs were pledged before, but how many of that are flowing to small developing states? Not much. Nope. And so one voice, I think, is exactly what Jeffrey is saying in terms of speaking up and calling for these reforms to the global financial architecture. And those reforms are absolutely necessary. Another example is calling for reforms with respect to the rating agencies and the way they view us in terms of there's an inherent bias against developing countries. Yeah. I mean, there's a natural bias. I know because I stand and say it. If we were told in a rating agency, I won't call the name because I don't want to point to everyone, that the reason why we weren't agreed doesn't matter that we did all these finance nice, we have reduced our debt, we have grown our economy, was because one, our economy was not diversified enough. We depend too much on tourism. Now, since I was born, and that was the case. We're doing it, but that's one. And two, we were vulnerable to climate change. No. Like, okay. What do I do with that?
Okay.
So if we get with one voice and start to speak to these things, call for reform in the rating agencies, view and assess our position, including that, then we will then make a difference.
Brilliant. It's really interesting to hear your views. I mean, you know, I get so tired of asking the same questions because I feel like I've been beating on the same drum for the last 15 years. And one of the things is, you know, why there's an inherent bias towards the African continent. And I feel, and I honestly feel this, that there's been a big change in the way we talk about ourselves and the narrative and the rhetoric coming out of the continent, where we just are tired of not being at the table, making the decisions and getting a unified voice. And I feel that's changing dramatically. Vice President, I want you to jump in here. Who are the best partners for Africa? Because, and the reason I ask this question is, the continent is still signing bad deals where we are signing off our raw materials, our raw commodities, our commodities as collateral, just to get specific funding for projects, as we try and shore up the Afreximbank balance sheet, for example, to be able to do mega projects. You were in the government, so you can tell us some of the conversations that were being had and whether we're getting fair deals and whether you think that things are changing.
I think it's important always to keep in mind that in this business there are no permanent friends, you know, just permanent interests. And Africa has to take that approach, you know. So, I mean, so there are those who will say, why go to China? You know, but China is offering the best deals. There are those who will say, are we ignoring America? No, we shouldn't. Are we ignoring the West? No, we shouldn't. I think that our decisions must be situational. They must depend on our own peculiar requirements at any point in time. So, for example, just taking the climate change issue, you know, who are our best partners today, you know? We decided in Kenya at the Africa Climate Summit that the development paradigm for Africa must be climate positive growth. In other words, we're no longer victims. We don't want to be regarded as victims. We want you to subscribe to an economic model that shows first, or that takes advantage of the fact that Africa has, you know, possibly the largest resources in terms of renewable energy, and also critical minerals. So see that as an economic opportunity. Invest. So who are our best friends? Those who are prepared to support that whole process. Those who are prepared to support our approach to that process. And we should be, you know, as dynamic, as nimble as possible in resourcing our friends, in finding our friends.
So this is the thing, right? If you see who's supporting this, if we just look at how much climate financing has come to the African continent, it's not much.
Yeah.
Yeah? So who's willing to support? It's like, well, you know, if we're not going to come if we don't make like really high double-digit returns. It kind of doesn't suit us.
I think the reason is because we have failed to make an economic argument for those investments.
Got you.
So the approach has always been that Africa is a victim, you know. So let's set up a fund.
We're not the victim.
You know, adaptation fund, loss and mitigation, all sorts of little funds that are never, by the way, ever fulfilled. No one ever fulfills those obligations. So they just set up those funds. But what we're saying now is that there is a proper economic argument. We're putting forward an economic model. We're saying that we have, for example, let's just take bauxite. 25% of the world's bauxite production is in Africa. So we're saying converting bauxite to aluminium using renewable energy will save the world 1% of global emissions. 1%. So it makes sense from the point of view of climate change. It makes sense from the point of view of our economy. So let's put our resources into it.
Fantastic. Okay, I'm going to be honest, this panel is going to go slightly over because we have a few topics we need to discuss. Dennis, I want to come to you. I want to talk about PAPS. I want to talk about your other payment systems that have taken hold. I mean, you've actually signed a deal with the Caribbean as well, yeah, with Barbados and Bahamas. And we were talking behind the scenes. We're like, how does this work? And we were having this great debate with Dr. Kabaruka as well. It's like, you know, countries trading with themselves, circumventing the US dollar, what is the settlement and so forth. Take us through what Afrexim is doing right now and whether it's working. You know, is it working? Can we trade amongst ourselves with our own currencies?
Yeah, no, thank you for that. I think as part of the AfCFTA implementation, Afreximbank working with the AU and the AfCFTA Secretariat with the idea of a Pan-African payments and settlement system, which is really meant to reduce the foreign currency content of intra-regional trade. Because it really doesn't make sense that trade amongst ourselves, we need another third currency to enable it to happen. We can use our own currencies to trade. Obviously, there will be a net position, and that net position can be settled in a third currency. But that will then free up the foreign currency that we have to do other things, infrastructure development, for example. So what we are trying to do is to match the supply and demand of local African currencies using PAPs. And for example, you can match demand for Egyptian pounds, Kenyan shillings, from the two countries. But if you include other countries as well, you will then notice that the net position becomes smaller.
Yeah.
And then that we can finance. So the Pan-African Payments and Settlement System was tested and it's currently being rolled out as we speak. So it is actually working.
And it's going well. There's supply demand. It's going well.
It's early days,
Okay.
but absolutely it's going according to plan.
All right, we're running out of time. I want just a few last comments. Governor Roll, you're also part of the pilot program right now.
No, we have a pilot that is being planned in the Caribbean, Barbados, and the Bahamas, and we are trying to get some of the other central banks involved. And I think we're going to be going through the same experience of understanding the multilateral settlement process. But the expectation is once we've gotten beyond the stage for human resourcing constraint reasons, more of the central banks are not able to participate in the pilot, but there's general acceptance that this is the way to move forward. And we understand, though, that this is just the payment rail. The next push is to have more integration at the market level in trade, and that is where this opportunity, I think, really is so great for us, because ordinarily, even if we are doing trade today, we are still subject to the correspondent banking issues around payments and settlements, and the delays that may be involved in the settlement process. So there's a great opportunity to be closer and more integrated for payments.
So as the world is becoming more protectionist, we need to figure out how to integrate with our partners. Dr. Kaberuka, I don't know if you thought you were going to get away with talking about this de-dollarization story, and what do you think, and whether it's doable? De-dollarization and sort of, is this going to happen, in the next few years or so forth? But, Africa working together to figure out its own payment systems, to be removed from the shackles of the dollar.
Look, I'm not an American taxpayer, so I should be careful what I say. But let me say, first of all, how I am a big supporter of the Pan-African payment systems. I really do. So I hope we remove the bottlenecks together. Now, I think we need to understand one thing, that at the end of World War II, there was only one country in the world with huge surpluses. That was the United States. All other countries are bankrupt, Germany, Japan, the whole of Europe. And so the dollar became the de facto global trade currency because of that factor of what happened then. But I just mentioned to you what happened in 1971 when President Nixon, because the US now had swung into a deficit, all right, devalued the currency. Okay. Still, the dollar has remained dominant currency. My take is that to think that the dollar will disappear is like saying the English language will disappear. It doesn't happen like that. But as you saw today from the summit in Russia, other currencies will emerge, beginning with what we call the near dollar currencies. There's of diversification now into Canadian dollar, Australian currency, New Zealand. The currencies which are not the US dollar, but as close to the dollar as possible, then other currencies will emerge. But I expect, because of the structure of global trade, for the US dollar to remain quite dominant in the market for some time. I say this because something like PAPs does not remove the use of the dollar, but reduces the demand for dollar immediately because countries can trade using their own currencies, and then the Exim Bank will settle what is the difference near the end. This is why I think we need to give a huge support to this program. I end by saying the following also, that the African Union in the early 2000 had the idea of creating a number of African institutions, including an African Monetary Fund, including an African Central Bank. It will take time. But remember, in 1997, during the Asian financial crisis, the countries in the ASEAN region came together around something called the Chiang Mai initiatives. It was to pool some of their resources, act like an insurance when a country has a problem. It didn't work very well because the surplus countries, which was China and Japan, all right, imposed some conditions. There was not enough of it, and the smaller countries who were borrowers also had issues. But the idea of the initiative itself, the Chiang Mai initiative, is something we can think about here in Africa. How do we pull together some of the resources which will act as an insurance when there is a global trade? And I hope among them one day there will be an African currency.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. Okay, we have to leave it there. We've run out of time. Thank you so much to everyone. Thank you for your insights. I hope you have a fantastic conference. I'm certainly excited to be here, and I wish you all the best. Thank you so much, gentlemen. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. I want you to give a round of applause based on how much you enjoyed that fantastic panel. Now, if I could ask my Eleni to please lead your panelists exit stage right here. There's a little bit more before we go to lunch, but this is a really interesting moment here because we have we have an award. Now, Africa is often described as the potential breadbasket of the world. The continent has more than 60% of the world's remaining arable land, and millions of Africans already productive in the agricultural sector. Now, if we work together to remove the barriers to agricultural development and put in the right investments, the right commitments, it's estimated that African agriculture output could increase from currently $280 billion today to $1 trillion by 2030. Afreximbank is committed to supporting agriculture, and today, together with the Forum for Agricultural Research, FARA, we honor the winners of the inaugural Afreximbank FARA Research, Innovation and Competence in Agriculture Award. Think about that acronym, AFRICA, the Africa Awards. Please roll the video. The Africa Awards, ladies and gentlemen, they recognize and celebrate individuals, groups of individuals, and established organizations that have recorded excellence in ASTI, Advancing Agricultural Innovation Systems and Agripreneurship in Africa. Now, I'm going to call to the stage my esteemed colleagues who will be presenting these two awards. On behalf of President Benedict Oramah, the President and the Chairman of the Board of Directors of Afreximbank, if I could please call to the stage representing Dr. George Elombi, Executive Vice President for Governance, Legal and Corporate Services for Afreximbank. As they come on, please give them a round of applause. George, where are you? There you are, George. George, I'm going to ask you to stand in the middle of the stage, please, and then sort of usher everybody else next to you. Next, I call on Dr. Aggrey Agumya, who is the Executive Director of FARA. You heard him speak before. He's back again. Dr. Yemi Kale, a Chief Economist at Afreximbank. Please join us. Dr. Christian Abu Lehauf is the Senior Manager, International Cooperation at Afreximbank. Please join us, Dr. Abu Lehauf. Mrs. Ama Asenso Adu Darte is the Head of Human Resources for FARA. Please welcome her. And finally, Dr. Abdul Rasak Ibrahim, Cluster Leader, Institutional Capacity and Future Scenarios for FARA. Now, that makes up our esteemed group that are going to be giving the Africa Award. Who gets the Africa Award, you're wondering? Well, first of all, this award is in two categories. The Africa Research Excellence Award is an award for $25,000 US. And the Africa Impactful and Evidence-Based Policies Award is for $10,000 US. And that's what they'll be receiving today. So I wish I had a drum roll, but I don't. So I'm going to announce the winner of the Africa Research Excellence Award. And the winner is, he's a distinguished professor and holder of the South African Research Chair in Post-Harvest Technology at the Faculty of Agri-Sciences, Stellenbosch University in South Africa. The winner of the Africa Research Excellence Award is Professor Umezurike Linus Okpara. And I believe he's here with us. Professor Okpara, our first inaugural winner of the Africa Research Excellence Award. Now, as he receives his award, let me just tell you, I said he was a fellow Nigerian national. He received the Africa Research Excellence Award for his contributions to post-harvest research, including developing an integrated value chain approach. I'm going to ask you to come this way and join your friends over here. Oh, aha. So you're going to receive the award. This is a formal occasion. We have to do this right. Now, his work reduces post-harvest losses, enhances value addition, and links production to local and international markets. Professor Okpara is also recognized for advancing Africa's research and innovation capacity in post-harvest science and technology through cutting-edge research, knowledge creation, and mentoring young researchers. He holds a bachelor's and a master's of engineering from the University of Nigeria, Nsukka, and a PhD from Massey University, New Zealand. He's published extensively, and he's a highly cited researcher with numerous prestigious awards, including the Africa Research Excellence Award. Now, the next award is for the Africa Impactful and Evidence-Based Policies Award. And the winner is a Malawian national. Now, I must say, there's no one in this room that hasn't heard the terrible news of the tragic plane crash that claimed the life of the Vice President of Malawi, Mr. Saulus Chilima. We had a minute of silence this morning to honor his life and that of the 9 passengers who died in that plane crash. That meant that this recipient was supposed to be here. He's a Malawian. But he had to cancel his trip. So I will ask one of my colleagues, maybe George or my colleagues from Afreximbank, Dr. Christian, to receive it on his behalf. I'm sure you'll get it to him. This is the Africa Impactful and Evidence-Based Policies Award for $10,000. And the winner is Richard Kandawire. Richard Kandawire. He's a Malawian national, and he's the Africa Director at the Alliance for African Partnerships and the Malawi National Planning Commission Chair. He previously headed the Comprehensive Africa Agricultural Development Program at NEPAD. He received the Impactful and Evidence-Based Policies Award for his foundational role in conceptualizing CAADP and promoting its adoption across African countries, significantly increasing agricultural investment. Professor Nkandawire advocates inclusive evidence-based policy processes and fosters partnerships among policymakers, the private sector, and knowledge institutions. Now, he's probably watching. I imagine he's watching from Malawi. So can you give him a round of applause so he can hear it all the way in Malawi, please? So, ladies and gentlemen, those are the award winners for the Africa Award, the Africa Research Excellence Award, and the Africa Impactful Evidence-Based Policies Award. That's it, completed. Thank you. Thank you. Yes. Thank you. Now, the global economy finds itself at a crossroads as we face what we're calling poly-crises, right? And each crisis seems to exacerbate the other. It's a feedback loop that makes addressing any single issue even more difficult. No one and nowhere is spared. Now, this next session, Africa and the Caribbean compare notes on how to manage macroeconomic crisis. Your moderator is the Senior Fellow, Brookings Institution, and member of the Monetary Policy Committee at the Central Bank of Nigeria. Please welcome Mr. Aloysius Uche Ordu.
Good day to everyone. My name is Aloysius Uche Ordu, as you just heard introduced. We are continuing this session we just concluded by looking at how countries in Africa and the Caribbean are responding to the multiple crises and challenges facing us today. We have talked about and heard of the complicated times we live in, the geopolitics, the geoeconomics, the multiple and synchronized interest rates, inflation, energy prices, etc. And of course, in the meantime, let's not forget that climate change is wreaking havoc across the African continent and also many of the countries in this region. So I am absolutely pleased to have with us today 3 panelists who will share with us some of what they are doing in their respective countries in response to this crisis. The first is Honorable Ken Ofori-Atta, who's the Economic Advisor to the President of Ghana and former Finance Minister of Ghana. Yeah, absolutely. Okay. Thank you.
Thanks, Aloysius.
Great. We also have Honorable Chad Blackman, who's the Minister in the Ministry of Economic Affairs and Investment in the Republic of Barbados. All right. Great, thank you. Okay, great. Thank you very much. We also have the Honorable Hassan Abdallah. He's the Governor of the Central Bank of Egypt. A round of applause for him, too. All right, panelists, thank you very much for joining us. Again, managing macroeconomic crises, some lessons from Africa and from the Caribbean. We're going to talk through some of those in the time we have available right now. Governor, let me start with you, the Central Bank Governor of Egypt. What measures and policies you have found effective in managing the multiple challenges that you've been facing?
Thank you very much. And first, I would like to thank Afrexim and our host country, people and government, for such a good organization. And I'm glad to be with you here. Now, that question is quite a heavy question. However, I will try as much as possible to address it from a practical point of view. First of all, everybody knows how the whole financial markets and financial architecture is not responding properly to the repetitive crises we're having. The geopolitical tensions are adding to it. The post-COVID was very severe, and the inflation was quite high. Now, that was affected almost all countries. Egypt, we had more than our share because we also were caught at a time where we had a lot of debt repayments, and with interest rates going up and risk premium as well going up, this puts a drain on the cash flow. And more important, inflation. And I believe that inflation is the one thing, the one disease that each country has to focus on. And what happened in Egypt simply is that when you have higher inflation and more important than inflation, which is a point that I want to make, is the expectation for inflation, which has been very high and founded, and it feeds on itself. It leads to negative real rate of return, which in turn leads to asset purchases and becomes a vicious circle. And of course, in a country like Egypt specifically, one of the most assets that are a recipient of this local money is the foreign currency. So this leads to exacerbating the problem more, having a foreign currency shortage. Now that's the problem. In order to address it, we have to understand our weaknesses in what we do. We have raised interest rates dramatically, a lot, okay, 18%, this is a lot, it's a big magnitude. However, increasing interest rates in itself without inflation expectations in place does not work. And it is very important to know that anchoring inflation expectations is key. And then also it is more important to go into a practical part and understand when I said your weakness. For instance, I am sure not only in Egypt, even in developed countries and most Africa, the transmission mechanisms are not as efficient as they are. In fact, in Europe, as a fact, it takes around 12 to 18 months for it to work. So in a case like Egypt, of course, plus hiking interest rate, we found it useful to increase the reserve requirement, which would be a tool to drain liquidity faster from the market. Now, then comes credibility. Credibility is extremely important to restore confidence in the market. And credibility comes from action rather than from words. And in this, my piece of advice is that we chose, in the central bank, to take some pain in order to come with a full package. Because in a situation like ours, and most of countries, the piecemeal does not work. So you need to come up with a full package that addresses the inflation expectation, the currency shortages, which a lot of countries have, and the business environment. And of course, I don't want to take much long, but most important also on the fiscal side, you need to address, there has to be harmony and synchronization, and you need to literally address the social need of the low-income people. And in Egypt, we've been doing this, and I'm proud of it. And we are also improving it by better targeting of these people. We have Takaful and Karama program. We have several programs that target specific people and specific families.
Right.
Thank you.
Honorable Governor, thank you. Thank you very much. And Honorable Minister, I was just wondering if you could also share with us what measures in particular you found very effective in terms of addressing the challenges in Barbados as well.
Thank you very much. Firstly, let me say also thank you to Afrexim for putting on such a timely panel at this time. In Barbados, let me set the context, of course, pre-COVID and post-COVID. Because the reality is that even before COVID, there were a number of inequalities that the country faced. We came from a situation where we were highly indebted, but the government took measures to ensure that we had the adequate policy space to be able to treat a number of these things. And why is that important? When you look at trying to address some of these challenges with respect to macroeconomic challenges, small states like Barbados are oftentimes caught in what I call a vortex. The vortex of being either classified as middle income or high income. And what does that mean? It means, therefore, your policy options to be able to treat to some of the challenges that you have are very limited. And therefore, the government has particularly called at the international level for a rethinking of the GDP per capita matrix, for example. Because why? A lot of these tools are embedded in the system where it doesn't take into reality or the fact that our countries, notwithstanding that you may have a high GDP per capita ratio, there are a number of inherent inequalities that preclude you from being able to do that. So that is one. What the government has done is gone further, because oftentimes in order to treat an issue, you can't just do it as a single nation state. You have to look at the entire multilateral development system. And therefore, Prime Minister Motley would have conceived and led the initiative, as we now know, the Bridgetown Initiative, which looks at calling for a reformation of the international financial architecture. So when you look at both the domestic reality coupled with the global reality, we therefore now have to ensure that we can have that policy space to be able to treat a number of these things. Because if you're indebted and then an external shock manifests, whether that be a climate shock, when you see the tensions around the world causing an increase in energy prices, countries like Barbados or the Bahamas or Trinidad and Tobago in the Caribbean are often therefore faced with a very difficult task of being able to treat to the external shock whilst paying down the debt that was there before. Now, if you're in a situation where you're then asked to go on the international market to get international finance, ideally, you need long-term financing options and not short-term. Because why? The high interest rates is going to choke your ability to do so. So the country and the region, CARICOM, has been calling for that reformation around the world. And there is traction. But as the governor said in the previous panel, there is a lot of work still to be done in this regard.
Right. Thank you. Thank you very, very much. Honorable Ken Ofori, I would like to turn to you now, because earlier on in the previous session, there was a lot of conversations about the perceived risk premium in terms of Africa, investing in Africa, and indeed some of the countries in this region. And putting some numbers to it is important. As you know, the UNDP actually quantified the interest costs and foregone lending to African countries, $75 billion as a result of the, what they call the idiosyncrasies in the sovereign rating agency assessment of African countries. You're somebody who's thought about this over time. What can be done? What can be done to really address this issue of perceived, in fact, Kaburuka called it the zip code, the zip code issue. Right.
Yeah, thank you very much indeed, and really thank Afreximbank for this session and for bringing it to the Caribbean. It's we have to unite or else we perish, so that's important. I think the issue of credit rating agencies, we've been fighting about this for a long while, simply because if you even look at the research, obviously the speed with which African and Caribbean countries get downgraded is a lot faster than most. But personally, for example, for Ghana, I think we went to market with Greece at some point in which, say for $1 billion, there was almost 400 basis points difference, which means that every year we pay $40 million more, times 30 years, that's 1.2 billion going out for absolutely no reason, except that Greece is in Europe, and therefore it is de-risked in a sense, and Ghana is in Africa. So that becomes the fundamental issue. I believe rating agencies was put there to facilitate the movement of capital. They have now become the gatekeepers, really creating a severe capital shortage in our countries. The question, Aloysius, is not that there's not enough money in the world. Assets under management are over 150 trillion. However, the covenants with which these pension fund managers operate with will not allow them to invest in a C country or triple B, etc. So suddenly, of all of that money that maybe Japan pension fund may have, it may be only about 50 million that can come to us. And it's not because they are earning really great rates with the balance of the money, but the perceived risk does that. And then that leads to a cyclical issue which continues to create this poverty. We have decided to look at creating an African credit rating agency. Now the question becomes, what is the credibility of that? How do you get the integrity for these pension fund managers to be able to bring resources. So those are things that we need collective action to change, because it's just 75 billion on the cumulative side. It's an awful lot of money going out.
Yeah, that's in fact 2 times more the concessional financing that goes to low-income Africa on a yearly basis. Let's stick with you, Honorable Minister, for one more for a moment, because the theme of this conference, as we all know, is to own our own destiny. That's very much important theme of the conference. And we know that part of owning our own destiny is also self-help, self-reliance. What can we do? And one area where we have control in what we can do is actually to raise the level of domestic resource mobilization. At a time when, concessional financing is in a dramatic decline and donor entities themselves are having challenges of their own in their own countries. What are we doing? How can we raise the level of domestic resource mobilization in our respective countries to fund our development?
Yeah. I think yes, DRMs have been quite anemic in our countries. I think Africa has maybe about 500, half a trillion of tax income that we get. But, Europe may have about 32%, revenue to GDP ratio. We are lingering around, 12, 13%. So imagine doubling that will put you beyond the trillion, which gives you the capital. Then you have the issue, therefore, of technology and an agreement to that. And so, for example, in Ghana, I tried to introduce an electronic levy tax, which Parliament, fought hard against. But that then, at the point in which the credit rating agencies downgraded Ghana, did not give us the type of revenue that we required. So we ourselves, and the taxable amount now has moved from 900 million Ghana cedis to now 1.7 trillion Ghana cedis. So that 1.25% that we wanted to levy would have resulted in more than the 3 billion that was ability in the way forward. So yes, we need to digitalize effectively. Technology will help. It will literally double everybody's rate. We need to also be cognizant of illicit financial flows, because that's a huge amount of money, of which 75% of it is literally foreign outflows that we are not policing properly. So those become areas that we need to really focus on going forward. And our own sociology of not wanting to pay taxes as a firm, but I guess that's global. Anywhere you cut it. But
15-16% is the most in terms of average tax to GDP ratio. No country in the world has ever made it to an advanced country without raising about 30% of their GDP in taxes. What is the situation here in the region?
Well, it's actually quite similar in the region. Again, it goes back to that constraint that I mentioned earlier. Countries in the Caribbean are precluded with that policy space. We're trying to raise, of course, you had to do it through taxes or growth. But to be able to do that in circumstances where your is going to make it very difficult, and that has been a major challenge. But if I can go back to what the minister mentioned on the issue of credit rating agencies, I think the time has long passed and is now for us even more now in the global south to have credit rating agencies that can stand the test of time. Because why? And no knock to them, but the credit rating agencies that we all look to in the world as we speak were not created by us or in our image. And therefore, how do you now ensure, and I was very glad to hear of the credit rating agencies coming out of Africa, there has to be agencies that can be created around the global south that can stand the test of time with the credibility, but that the world also will respect. Because why? They have moved away from their original intent, and the implications are massive to our economies. So that is one. And two, how do you then leverage on the issue of South-South cooperation and liquidity? Because there's a lot of finance going on in our part of the world. But if we don't harmonize our approaches and try to unlock it where it is, a lot of the mobilization that we're needing is not going to be unlocked, but it is there. The question is, what mechanism and instruments do we now have to be able to unlock that?
Right. Let me turn to you, Governor. The expectation now in the global economy is that the US dollar will be stronger for longer. From your perspective as the governor of the Central Bank of Egypt, what are the implications as you see coming down the pike of a strong dollar, stronger for longer?
Are you talking strong against international currencies or local currencies? Totally.
So, could you help us with both?
Well, international currencies, as you know, it has been range-bound for some time, and it looks like it's going to be in a range or a consolidation phase for some time. And of course, it is all hinging about the level of interest rates, the cuts, and how fast they're going to be, or some people lately, before today's number, were talking about even a small hike. So that's mainly, in my opinion, is not going to go in an aggressive way. The other question I would like to answer, despite no one would be calling a level, but it's a problem of our weak currency, not about the US dollar. It's a problem of us mediating the dollar in all our transactions. And here perhaps is one of the good things that despite it is still going to take time, but dealing with each other in our currencies at the end would allow to decrease the amount of movement of funds through international currencies. Again, when you talk about most currencies in Africa, other than the ones that are pegged, most of us get a lot of pressure on our currency, and some countries tend to not weaken their currency in the way that would absorb shocks. And this is a conceptual difference between a lot of people, because unfortunately in our people mind and in most political mind, a strong currency is good for the economy and good for the people. And that's only been there for a long time, very hard to change. But in reality, as you can see, the currency war is different. Everybody, if is competitive, wants to have lower. Our problem, real problem, is that when we export basic goods, no value added. If we put value added to it, then our currencies would be okay. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Minister Blackman, same question. For island economies like yours, what are the implications of a stronger dollar for longer?
Well, let me put it this way. Of course, most of our economies are tourism-based, and therefore, not all, but most. And therefore, when you look at the strength of the dollar, given that we import most of our goods to service, for example, our tourism-based economies, it has a major implication. Now, that aside, again, I want to go back to the whole issue of South-South. For a long time, we've held the view that in order for us to trade, we must trade only in the US dollar, or in the euro, or in the pound. And whilst this is a potentially controversial view, there is the time, and I think a number of countries are now doing that. We also must look at trading amongst ourselves in our currencies, because one, what it does is appreciation over time. Two, it lends credibility to those markets where the currencies are. And when you look at the current geopolitical shifts taking place in the world, I'm no prophet, but I believe within the next 10 to 15 years, a number of the currencies that we're now looking to may not be in the same position that they are today. So the question is, how do we prepare ourselves for that eventuality and that shift which will take place? And the fact is, a lot of our currencies are pegged to the dollar, for example. So conversations must now be had, not just at the domestic level, but also between the Caribbean and Africa, in looking at perhaps a basket of currencies that we should actually start to look at that can anchor our monetary policies.
Great. Honorable Minister Ken Ofori, earlier on this morning, the former Vice Chair of the U.S. Federal Reserve, Dr. Roger Ferguson, shared some lessons for Africa and the Caribbean from the East Asian countries. Among the things he mentioned that the emphasis on education was an important lesson he drew from East Asian countries for the African continent. The focus on infrastructure and the high savings rates that underpin investments. As a policymaker who has really spent time thinking through these issues on the African continent, what are your own sense of the lessons we Africans and the Caribbean region should draw from East Asia?
Thank you very much. I think just segueing a bit on the dollar. People don't know when the power of empires are diminishing. And so I think it's inevitable. If I just juxtapose the fact that by 2050, Africa will be a quarter of the world's population and 1 billion also of youth, it can't be that the system will sustain itself. And therefore, enlightened self-interest should be pushing the world towards really looking at this whole reserve currency issue. But maybe to help ourselves, instead of having 43 currencies in Africa, we may want to have one or so, and that would change the trade pattern, that would change that, so that would be helpful. I think we all have to confront the issue of China and India, and I think one of the distinguishing issues there is education, in which if we look at our first president Nkrumah, he really pushed that. And then the current president, Akufo-Addo, brought in free senior higher education, which the opposition party thought was not possible to finance. And his clarity was that there has to be social mobility and that your best asset are the people. And I think that's one of the steps that South Africa missed in the past 30 years, which becomes very problematic when you are trying to change a society. And so, yes, education is going to be important because I think we are moving from a situation where you have one company hiring 10,000 people into a situation where 10,000 people are financing their own jobs and getting one or two people to work with them, which means that the pedagogy of education should change to be more entrepreneurial and sometimes more skill-based as opposed to what we have now. Is going to be key to that. The climate issue, Africa is a clear carbon sink. Sequestration can't go on. We need to break this issue of pricing of carbon credits so that we get something that is in high demand, as they have taught us in classical economics, should have a high price. Suddenly, it's a volunteer market in which we are not generating what we should generate. So those issues have to be contended with. And the whole location of the financial architecture. Why should Ghana and Cote d'Ivoire have, 60-70% of the world's cocoa, and the commodities trading desk is somewhere else? And I think that the courage to reimagine the future and for leadership to go against the trend is what we need in the next few years, because it will lead to better productivity globally in the long run, with the demographics of the West going the way it is. The cauldron of development and productivity will have to come from Africa. And enlightened self-interest should allow people to sit down again, reevaluate, and understand that it is in their own interest, whilst we Africans also take advantage of the moments in technology and leverage it.
Thank you very much. Honorable Minister, there was a sense of that's mentioned by Minister Ken Ofori, the reform of the international financial architecture, I just heard him say, and some of the best-known reform agenda have come from your own country, from this region. I was just wondering, from where you sit, how do you see the evolving reforms, and what can we do to make sure that the reforms are beneficial to our collective South Africa, Caribbean?
I think, first of all, we have to really keep pushing the agenda. As you mentioned, the Bridgetown Initiative is a very good and real example of that. But we have to also not just look at the financial architecture and reform. You asked a very pertinent question: how can we ensure that it's successful? We have to really use the multilateral system, or member states around the world, in the UN, for example, to ensure that when they're at the table, they constantly bring these issues that are faced by the global South, and in particular the Caribbean and Africa, to ensure that it is not just an issue that it's topical or trending for 2 or 3 years, but these are systemic issues that have to be addressed in the long term. And therefore, you need a whole of the global South approach, but equally partnering with the global North, because oftentimes we believe that it is our issue to address, or sometimes it's their issue to address on our behalf. We have to have partnerships as well. So the issue of common cause on a number of issues will be key. But lastly, I think when you look at the whole question of, I'm going back to what the minister said, that view of self-belief, for us to have, when I say us, in African context, broadly, the world's largest resources of key sectors around the world, but the value added is outside of Africa. Why is that? The technology is there. The research and development is there. So even our institutions of academic import must now help our private sector to reimagine what these commodities can do, so that when we export around the world, that the revenues come to our economies backed by intellectual property, and therefore we now create a new wave of wealth for our regions. It will take time, but we have to be persistent as we go.
Great. Thank you very much. Honorable Governor, let me turn to you. There are just so much that are positive. We often forget caught up in all the challenges and the crises we hear about. The African Continental Free Trade Area is one of those examples of, the continent coming together. The way the Afreximbank and the Africa CDC and other African institutions rallied during COVID showed very much what the continent can do when we act together. And studies after studies and reports launched over the years, the issue has been that if the continent, with its population and the demographic dividend, with the technological change evolving, if the continent could grow on average by 7% a year for the next 3 decades, we could transform the African continent. What is stopping us from achieving that 7% growth?
Well, in my opinion, you have a technology issue, technology transfer, and the financing issue. And these are, and of course, what you have mentioned before with the Minister, education. But what I'm seeing today, of course, is not a big number of people, but however, I see a lot of Africans being educated in best schools, and we're starting to make focus on it. So then comes the financing, the liquidity we need, as well as the technology transfer. And I believe that Afrexim is doing several projects in this respect, where it's bringing financing with business, and specifically intra-African. And I believe this in itself is going to be one of the initiatives that takes us forward.
Thank you very much. And Honorable Minister Ken Ofori, you too, this idea that 7% growth is attainable, what is stopping us?
What is stopping us?
Yes.
I think we need just courage and truly to reimagine the future and to be really confident about where things are going with regards to demographics, with regards to where we are with climate, and therefore what we are going to use of our human capital and technology at this point. So courage, I mean, we've heard Minister's Prime Minister, come out very strongly about the issues of climate and the global financial architecture. We need to bring that front and center to continue with that. I remember during the COVID time, the courage of Professor Orama to say, look, let's find that $1 billion to be able to stop this vast sovereignty that was happening. And once he triggered it, the World Bank and everybody then was ready to help. So the issue of having our capital and then driving the change is going to be, there has to be a fierce sense of urgency to do that, because it's also the right thing to do. And therefore not to be looking east or west. As Nkrumah said, it's not going east or not going west, but we got to look forward. And that's what we have to do. And Mandela left us saying also that, it looks impossible until it is done. And it is all possible. So I'm really quite optimistic about the future after the new leadership that is emerging and the sense of purposefulness that is coming. The learnings that we have with the diaspora and community, and therefore we having the capacity to be at every table that makes the rules. We have to make the rules. We have enough wood, as Prime Minister Motley said, that if they don't give us a chair, let's make our own chairs and put it there for them.
I think on that note, I have two more questions to ask, but I think we'll run out of time. You want to add anything to the sustained growth of 7%?
No, but I will take the opportunity, however, to call for a continued look at the reform of the international financial architecture. Why? The current architecture mirrors a system that was created by countries, or let me put it another way. Most of our countries did not exist when the current architecture that we now operate under was created. And therefore, with new challenges, new realities, deep inequalities, therefore we have to now ensure that that financial architecture is reformed if we're going to treat to these challenges. There are opportunities. As the Minister said, we have to reimagine what Africa can do, what the Caribbean can do, because we have the intellectual muscle to do so. But therefore, policy space, financing options and access has to now go hand in hand with that reformation. And I think once we can sustain that over the long term, we're going to start to see the gains of growth and sustained development that we all want to see.
Thank you very much. On behalf of the Afreximbank, a round of applause for our panelists, please. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you. We'll follow up. Yeah? Okay. Okay, thanks.
And together we know that it is possible to deliver on a new vision for Africa and its people. It is possible to harness the talents, the abilities, and the energies of Africa's youth to deliver on the aspirations of our founding fathers and mothers. It is possible to forge the partnerships that Africa needs to drive a new paradigm in our reality. It is possible! It is possible! It is possible! This is the mantra world.
Stories to be told and lessons to behold. Time has come to be bold. Time to find the lost gold. Food for the mind and soul.
Thank you. Thank you for giving me my mic there. Ladies and gentlemen, if I could ask you to take your seats, we're almost at lunch break, but I've got something very exciting and a little bit different for you. So if I could ask all those people in the front here, those people, my friends in the front here, I'm going to start calling names because I know everybody's names. If you could just take a seat, please. If everybody could take a seat, we have a very special signing ceremony for you. This one is a memorandum of intent that outlines the preliminary understanding of parties who plan to enter into an agreement. Now, I don't know about you, but it took me 26 hours to get here on the flight here to the Bahamas, so I had a lot of time to watch movies. And one of the movies that I watched coincidentally on the plane, it was a powerful movie, and it features one of the signatories of this MOI. It's called The Woman King. I recommend it. It's a fantastically exciting movie. And it tells the story of the Agoji, an all-female warrior unit that was protecting the West African kingdom of Dahomey between the 17th to the 19th century. Now, the signatory who is going to sign, the first one that I call up today, is of course the star of that movie. And I want you to give her a round of applause. She is, of course, the Emmy, the Grammy, the Oscar, the Tony Award-winning actress, Viola Davis. Now, Viola, Lovely, Viola. I'm going to ask you to take a seat on the table in the far corner. As you know, these chairs are waiting for you to have a little chat. But in the meantime, if one of my colleagues, if you could just take one of the seats over here, on this table over here, I'll call the rest of the signatories. There are 2 more signatories, so I think we need 1 more chair, probably on that table. Now, signing on behalf of Afreximbank is another woman king. Please give a round of applause for Miss Kanayo Awani, Executive Vice President, Intra-Africa Trade and Export Development Bank at Afreximbank. Now, I said there were 3 signatories for this, right? There were 3 signatories? Yes, another woman king, exactly. Give a warm round of applause to the CEO of FEDA, Miss Marlene Nguyi. Is there a lawyer or 2 in the house? I need a lawyer with a very important looking document and a fancy pen, please. Where are my lawyers? Aha, perfect. They're coming over there. I see them there. We have witnesses, of course. I'm going to actually call on, is Professor Orama? Professor Orama. Please, round of applause, please. The first time he's taking the stage today, or no, the second time he's taking the stage today, to come and witness this very important signing. Prof. Please, you know the drill. Stand at the back there. Now I guess you're asking me, what are they signing? Well, this signing ceremony between Viola Davis, managing partner of JVL Media, the slogan is Connecting Global Africa with the Tools to Make a Difference. This memorandum of intent represents a formal agreement between Afreximbank, Fund for Export Development in Africa, FEDA, and JVL Media to engage in a partnership aimed at fostering the advancement of publishing and Africa's film development value chain. The collaboration also intends to facilitate the promotion of African narratives, Afro narratives, within the global cinema industry through the Creative Africa Nexus program. Most of you know CANEX, right? It's a multifaceted intervention aimed at supporting and developing Africa's rapidly growing creative sector. Now, you've signed? You've signed. Fantastic. You've exchanged? Aha, then you have to exchange. If I could ask you to stand, please. And one last thing to do, I suppose, is stand, and one last thing for you is to give, I guess, a wonderful round of applause for this. This is what we need, telling African narrative, African stories, and we do it together. We do it together. Global Africa narrative, says Prof. Of course, the global African narrative. Congratulations to all the signatories. Now, as I ask you all, do you want to take a photo here? Okay, there are 150 cameras here. I'm sure, Viola, you're used to that. The rest of you, please join in.
What we gonna do?
Thank you very much. Now we have Viola Davis here with us. Do you want to hear a little, shall we have a little chat? Yes or no? Yes, yes, okay. Wonderful. Okay, so Viola, I'm going to ask you, someone will take that for you, I think, yes. I'm going to ask you to just join me over here as everyone exits stage left or whatever. And I don't know where, you're probably sitting anywhere. This is a nice spot for you. I wish this was my interview, Viola, but it's not. They got someone younger and better looking with more hair, right? So I'm going to call on our moderator. I want you to give him a round of applause. It's Oscar Jimenez. He is also an Emmy Award-winning author and journalist at CNN. Omar Jimenez. Where are you? Omar Jimenez.
everybody. How are you? We ready? Great conversation? All right, you're not here to listen to me. All right. Look, as you just heard, I'm sitting next to some great folks here, but I do want to give you a little bit more of an introduction. So to my left is Julius Tenen, incredible actor, award-winning producer, has been in this business for over 3 decades, holding it down ever since. An incredible accomplishment. Yes, round of applause. As you know and heard, Viola Davis, EGOT winner, film producer, and then also Lavelle Levette, New York Times best-selling author and editor, all of them managing partners on a newly minted JVL Media, which we can get into a little bit later. But I want to start, Viola, just with you and that moment that you just had right there. I'm just curious to you, what does that moment mean to you?
What that moment meant to me was freedom. And freedom and autonomy, which is control over your own voice and work. And that is what's been missing. It's missing in the world. We know that with us, with people of color, with black people. But it's also really sorely missing in our industry, where you fall prey to characters, to movies that literally the studio controls, people who don't look like you control, and then you have to just follow suit and do the best you can and hope that people see you through all the sort of junk that they put on you. And so for me, I keep thinking about what I hear over and over again is everything that I've ever wanted in my life is on the other side of fear. And I think that I've always been afraid to jump out and say, I want control, that's my legacy. And now, so this represents freedom. Freedom.
Yeah. And of course. And Julia, so I want to bring you in here. I mean, all three of you all have made your names in storytelling, oftentimes storytelling of marginalized communities, of communities that look like you and I. And Julius, you said something, I forget the interview, it was a few years back, but essentially that you have wanted to steer away from the tropes and stereotypes of people of color and show a broader spectrum of humanity. What does that mean to you?
Well, it means everything. It means that we are seen as human beings. So often in media, we can be depicted as not human metaphors or tropes and those things. And so it's important to always lean into authenticity of who we are as people, authenticity of stories. If I want to tell a story about this bottle, let's tell a story about this bottle of water and you and I having this conversation. And it means something. And so, you know, it's always about getting to truth. And that's what we've always done at JUV and now with JVL. We look forward to expanding that even more.
Yeah, and I think about what you just said a lot, because in my job, a lot of times I go into communities that you may not go into. I end up being a window into places that I think are important. And the way you just described this bottle of water, if you all don't know what a bottle of water is, your idea and understanding of what a bottle of water is going to be filtered by what we say. And so, Lavelle, I want to bring you in on that point, because obviously an accomplished author, editor, publisher, but also you have had the unique circumstance of writing both children's books and books for a wider audience. And so talk about that relationship that we just had, but particularly in respect to children and how their minds can be crafted at such a young age when they don't know what's out in the world, and it's up to us to explain it.
Right, and it's something when you say they don't know. We have something that we say, you don't know me yet, right? People, places, and things that we need to know about. And, you know, when I grew up, there's so many things on the continent of Africa that we were not exposed to as children. And so there's this disconnect for my generation. And what we hope to do through JUVL and through our storytelling is to connect the dots with that, and so that our children will not be deprived of what we were deprived of, knowing our history, knowing the connectivity between what is happening on the continent and how we all are of one. You know, we are all kinfolk. And knowing our history, there's so many things about the courage and the culture of what's happening on the diaspora that many of us aren't exposed to, vice versa. And so we hope through books that are fiction and nonfiction, through children's books, through movies, through immersive media, we hope to tell those stories. We hope to open the world to everyone. And so, yes, we're going to tell our stories from our perspective, but these are stories that all of the world needs to know about, and so we hope to expose that.
And one of the things, just in my mind, when we contextualize it within this conference, a lot of this conference is business. There's business managers meeting business managers, account managers meeting account managers, and there have been explorations of how to leverage Africa's economic resources. And the way I look at what you all do is you have the opportunity to leverage Africa's humanity resources to show that there are similarities to the same emotions you and I go through across the world, but also uniqueness in the way that those emotions actually play out in their lives. And that brings me to a question for you, Viola, because, look, I think a lot of times the major, at least Hollywood productions, look at Africa in a certain light, or there are only certain types of stories that are told. For example, a story like Blood Diamond or Hotel Rwanda, where there are elements of truth there, but it limits to that type of trauma storytelling. And I think of a movie like yours, The Woman King, and how sort of that change introduced a different type of narrative. So I'm curious for you, how do you expand that storytelling to include all of the rest of what Africa has to offer in a room that may not want to hear it?
Here's the thing. I don't think that great storytelling is the absence of trauma. I do think it could be the presence of trauma, but also the presence of joy, because that is what makes a life. That as soon as your life you think is falling apart, something funny and buoyant happens, right? Falling in love, the whole sort of trajectory of a relationship, finding yourself, I don't know, whatever story you could think of. How many people are in this room? You all have a different story. The problem with our storytelling is it's through a white gaze. And a lot of times, there are plenty of white people out there that have no relationship to us. And so we remain drug addicts. We remain mothers who are crying over our dead sons' bodies because they got stopped in a police and, they got killed in a police-involved shooting. It's very limited. And so what we're doing through storytelling is humanizing us to expand the storytelling, saying that we're more than just drug addicts. Maybe we're just a mother. Maybe we can't get a date. Maybe it's a story about, I don't know, a woman who literally is trying to find herself after a divorce. Because what happens when you do that is when an audience comes in and witnesses that storytelling, they see themselves in what they see on the screen. That is considered excellent storytelling. But when you limit us in our humanity, and that's through trauma, see, all the movies that you mentioned are all white people were in the lead in most, so it wasn't our story. It just happened to be based in Africa, but it's not our story. I'm saying that we want to be the center of our narrative, who we are in all of who we are, which sometimes has a lot to do with being black and doesn't have a lot to do with being black. And so therefore our storytelling becomes expansive and it becomes ours, just ours alone. And that's all I would like to do. Just tell a simple story. That's it.
Yeah. And Julius, you're in a unique position as well. I mean, you all are, where I think too in my job, one of the hardest parts of my job is pitching a story, is getting people to buy into, hey, I think this is a great idea. Let's go out and shoot this story. Let's go interview this person. To create a film, I mean, I can only imagine the amount of meetings you have to have. And I'm curious for you, if we want to stick on specific examples, When the movie Black Panther came out, Marvel's Black Panther, did that change conversations that you may have had more trouble having in Hollywood pitch rooms? And if it did, I'm curious, why do you think that happened?
Well, I mean, I think that with Black Panther, it opened up more of a window for us to tell stories in Africa. And although, you know, Black Panther was based on fantasy, it was still an important story. And to have all those creators and a story about the continent, it was important. Because oftentimes when I go in these rooms, there's no one like me, and I'm trying to pitch stories about us, and it has shifted. And in our journey with Woman King, which was a 7-year journey to get that film from a treatment to the screen, we were relentless. But we had people who were open enough to kind of continue to move forward. And so we moved forward. But it's always within us moving forward that sometimes there's deficits along the way. So The Woman King was an incredible movie. But there was parts of that movie that we couldn't tell because we couldn't really assess the kind of budgets we wanted to have. But the fact that we told that story, we got it told, and it's about the Ogogia in Africa, our people. My first time being in Cape Town, me getting this feeling, wow, I'm on this ground, and I belong here. And so it's been incredible, and it's opened up a lot more things. And so now with this agreement with AfricaXM, we just look to expand on that and have more autonomy and be able to tell these stories about us that are so important.
And Lavelle, I'm going to ask you a wrinkle of that question. Is it similar in when you're trying to get a book published, when you're meeting with publishers? I don't want to say there are less components involved, but different components in that storytelling medium. What are some of the things that you've really struggled to go up against in that field?
Right, and it's really the same story.
Yeah.
Whether it's film or books, you have that industry that's controlled by another. And we have very unique stories that are special to our culture that we want to tell the way that we want to tell them. But oftentimes there is the overseer that might say, well, why don't you change a little bit here? Why don't you tweak a little bit here? And all of those to me are messages to say, can you change it a bit to make us a bit more comfortable in your story? Yes. And I think that with this partnership, and I'm so thankful for the vision of the President CEO of AfricaXM Bank and the CEO of FETA for being on that, say, funding side, but also being very creative to say that we want to partner with some creatives, and we don't only want to make a difference, but we want to help be the difference. And that's how we feel AfricaXM Bank and FETA is going to be with us in this partnership, helping us to make the difference, meaning making the difference in being the overseers of our own stories, being able to tell our stories unfiltered, the way that we see them, the way that we want our audiences to see them. And so, yes, we are up against that in traditional publishing and traditional movie making. And we hope that this partnership and the vision that all of the leaders within this partnership have, that we're going to, like I keep bringing back to, there's a thing about making a difference, but there's a thing about being the difference. And I think that this partnership can be the difference, not only for us, but for those to come. And last night at dinner, we had lovely conversation with the leadership, and we talked about, we live in today, right now, which is the present that we are living in, but we're also thinking about the future that we seek. And in that future that we seek, with this partnership, we are laying the foundation for us to trail, but those that are coming behind us to trail and do. We're setting the seeds and do it, and they may follow it, but at least it's there because it's not been there before.
You all must be giving great answers, because I never get a round of applause after an answer of mine. Viola, I want to actually piggyback a little bit on what Julia said, because in the process of making The Woman King, you know, years-long process, a story rooted in African history, did you find anywhere along that journey that maybe there was something missing from African storytelling? When you did it, you said, you know what, I am glad we did this because I feel like whatever this is might be missing from the overall storytelling around what Africa is and its history. I'm just curious if in that process you learned that maybe this is filling a gap that we don't have.
Yes.
Yeah.
Absolutely, I felt that way. When we went to Africa, the overall conversation from everyone, people who came even in our crew, was we didn't know Africa was like this. We didn't know y'all had malls. And, you know, the beautiful homes near the Indian Ocean, seriously, there was not that sense in me. I mean, yeah, the malls surprised me a little bit, but there was not that sense in me, but there is still a sense that people have distended stomachs and everybody lives in poverty. And I think that is by design. I think when you continue to dehumanize a race, then that can excuse the oppressor to treat you poorly. It can justify their actions.
Because it feels part of a narrative, almost.
Absolutely, it's a part of the approach. But what I say is the oppressor can't be the healer. The only person you can heal is yourself, right? That's what they tell you. And I think there is a part of us, African Americans, probably Africans, that have literally embraced the images that have been filtered through the white gaze. So we always have to look beautiful in order to be worthy. We have to be in Black Panther and do backflips and carry swords and be able to disappear and fly to feel worthy. We have to be that cute Black woman, that is lighter than a paper bag in a romantic comedy in order to be worthy. That's what we have to do. And what I say is all of those things can be true, but there's a whole other side of storytelling. Our job as artists is to take life and filter it through us, through our talent, and give it back to you. So life is way more expansive than Marvel, than a romantic comedy, than a metaphoric horror movie. We're way more vast than that. And so we have to have the courage to be able to forge a path and tell those stories that haven't been told. Like that famous sort of adage of how many people want to change? And everybody raises their hands, right? Everybody wants to change. But who wants to change? And in order to change, you have to see all kinds of images that are realistic that we even haven't seen. We may even reject. We had a lot of comments during Woman King that they wanted more lipstick and less dirt. Okay? And that wasn't just from white people. So it is up to leaders to go up there and bring the storytelling to you so you can open your mind and be moved by the fact that that's me on that screen. That's who I am. And that gives you the courage to go out there in the world and to forge a path that is authentic. That's the power of art.
And one of the things that you hit on right there that I think is so important is, I live in New York City now, and I didn't always live there, but I had this idea of what New York was based on what I saw in movies, what I saw in television shows. And guess what? It's different than what it was as it was portrayed. And Julius, for you all have made so many movies, either acted in, shows, everything, you name it. Is there any perception of a certain situation or scene that you feel you've been able to change based on the work that any of you have done?
Well, I think any time we're out there working, I think any African American, any African actor, when you're out there and you're working, you're always hoping that you're going to make some kind of impact. I mean, as an artist, it's our job to study life. And when you take on any character, then you just go there. And we've seen so many beautiful examples of that, of African American actors, of African actors. And, you know, it's just important to know that, you know, you try to make a filet mignon out of a piece of chicken, you know, because sometimes it's not there. But I think it's always impactful when we're out there trying to do work that's meaningful.
Yeah. And Lavelle, look, part of this conference, part of this discussion is about creating a more prosperous next generation for Africa. And I just, can you contextualize or define almost the power of the word, of the written word, and what the role of the written word is going to be in creating a more prosperous Africa, just from your perspective?
You know, I'm going to go just a little bit to the question that you just asked when you say what's impactful. And I would have to say that, and that Viola's book, Finding Me, I mean, all of her work is very impactful, right? But that book, I've had more people than any tell me how Viola's words has changed their lives. You know, her bringing authenticity to the book world. I mean, telling it as it is, as raw and sometimes as painful and maybe uncomfortable at some points. But I think that work and the audio of you listening to her tell her story was mind-blowingly and impactful. And that story was told the way she wanted to tell it. And that's not easy because it's actually published by a mainstream publisher. And she could speak to that, but I think that being able to tell stories like that, you know, truthful, as is raw, is very important for our kids to read and to see and to understand. So, and the written word is so important, and it said those that write, that tell the story is the story that lives the test of time and over again. But we want to be those that tell our stories and not have people tell our stories for them. Yeah. So I think that's very important. I think it's also important, the importance of literacy and the importance of parents understanding how important and how impactful reading and stories can be for their young ones. And so helping to get kids excited about reading and writing as well.
Yeah. And just on that book, my fiance listened to that audiobook. I didn't know she was listening to it. She had headphones on. She's just crying and sobbing. And I was like, what are you listening to? She was listening to your words. So that impact, it's so incredible how acute that can be. I want to end on kind of a more fun question because, look, Julius, Viola, you guys are business partners, producing partners, but you are also partners in life. You have been married for decades at this point. I'm getting married in a few weeks, so you all are my example here. But I'm curious for you, just as business partners this whole time and as partners in life, has one informed the other? How you work together professionally, has it informed how you love each other, and how you love each other, has it informed how you work professionally?
Well, it's about supporting one another, right? It's about listening to one another. And for us men, it's about knowing when you have a woman who's got the stature and leadership qualities and the voice of a Viola Davis, you got to know who you are. I know who I am. She knows who I am. So guess what? It works. But it all starts with listening to one another, and we share a lot of the same commonalities about how we see the world, how we see content, how we see everything that makes up life.
I think the best part of, besides the fact that you're cute.
I'll take that.
That's a good
He's
start.
a hunk.
It's a good start.
But anyway, but what I was going to say is it's great to share a legacy with someone that you know that when you get married, at least I know this, that this is a person you're going to be with until you leave this earth. And so what do you want to leave behind? You know, what is going to last? It's like when the last person has a memory of you, TVL, media, and to work together and create these great stories like Woman King, like G20 that's coming out, we're leaving, I say, embers inside of people that can become huge flames. And it's great that that's what our love has created. You know, it's not just, you know, being with a really hunky, beautiful man. But it's in creating something that is transcendent.
And bigger than ourselves.
There we go. I'm going to need that recording. I'm going to have to write that down. It's a great advice. We're out of time, everyone, but I really appreciate your attention before lunch. Julius Tenen, Viola Davis, Lavelle Levette, everyone give them a round of applause.
And a round of applause for Omar Jimenez from CNN for that great moderating. That was rich and nourishing, was it not? Well, speaking of nourishing, it's time to nourish you. Lunch is served. Let me tell you what's going to happen. If you are a central bank governor or a finance minister, it's going to be at Café Bouloud restaurant, which is in Rosewood. You don't have to walk there. There is a shuttle bus outside waiting to whisk you to Café Bouloud restaurant in Rosewood. For the rest of us, we are going to take this hour for lunch, and it's served in the lunch marquee tent outside. Very easy. Ushers will show you where to go. Let's be back here at 3 p.m. 3 p.m. Let's be back here at 3 p.m. There's so much more on this agenda for global Africa. See you at lunch.
Plus on avance, plus il se dévoile, plus le mythe s'effondre.
Vous avez un journaliste qui n'est heureusement plus aujourd'hui sur RFI et qui conseille des chefs d'État en Afrique, qui s'appelait Alain Foka. Donc vous pouvez écouter les éditos qui sont pas du tout dans le sens de ce narratif positif sur le partenariat que nous avons avec l'Afrique.
Le lion a vraiment perdu ses dents. Quand on écoute ça, ça donne envie de paraphraser le président Laurent Gbagbo. Devant, c'est maïs.
En face, c'est maïs. En face, c'est maïs.
Je n'aurais jamais pris sur moi de répondre à une telle accusation, une telle diffamation, si cela se limitait aux joutes traditionnelles et trop souvent haineuses des réseaux sociaux. Mais là, il s'agit tout de même de Anne-Sophie Havé, ambassadrice pour la diplomatie publique de la France en Afrique, nommée par le président Emmanuel Macron en personne.